And I ran into my shadow. I ran into my dark side. I ran into how I can behave when pressed and threatened. And I wouldn't have said I was capable of being that unhelpful.
Yeah.
And I am.
Yeah. All right, Kirk, this is the Hard But Worth It podcast.
Welcome back.
And you know as well as I do, we don't have a major script written for these things. So as we're getting ready to record this, we thought, hey, let's put you in the spotlight today. So this is
My favorite and least favorite place to be simultaneously, right? Please, please, please. Oh, crap.
Yeah, exactly. So we're just gonna lob out the question and then just kind of play back and forth with it. But you know, I'm sure you have more than one hard but worth it moment in your life. But sometimes those hard moments don't reveal the worth it until maybe a season or years later.
Yeah.
Talk to us about a hard but worth it moment scenario in your life, and then let's just kind of have that conversation.
Yeah. This one did take years for me to find value for. I think that might be why it may have landed as deep as it did, because I had to wrestle and experience more of life before I could even understand what happened. And the interesting thing about this story is I've never processed this with the people that were involved, and I can guarantee you they have their own perspective on what happened. So it's interesting to share it as publicly as this is, not really knowing how those people interpreted it. But I know how I did. And so in many ways, this is a story of the biggest failure of my business career. And I know how...
So you're saying like some big words there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The biggest failure
of my leadership career. Yeah.
Wow.
It was a leadership failure.
Sure.
I know the ways I failed in it. I think we all did, but it's just no point in telling other people's stories, right? What happened was we were a bunch of managers running different companies in this town, and a couple towns in a region. We're all selling similar products to similar customers, competing against each other. And there was three of us, and we had this moment of genius where we decided to merge all three companies into one mega company, right? One, like we're gonna be able to compete,
take over the world.
Really compete with the big gorilla. There was a big gorilla in town.
Got it.
And we just couldn't. We were competing with them. It was fine, but we thought this will be interesting. We also had an idea, very, very, very competitive, low margin products, and I think a couple of us had this idea that we probably had one too many competitors.
Right.
And there was what we thought was one weak link, and maybe we could, and at one point, I actually offered that manager a job. I'm like, hey, maybe if we steal that manager, get him to come work for us, it'll sort of take this one out. They're weak right now. And so I called him one day and tried to recruit him, and he told me no. And a year later, we actually, the companies that we worked for became the weak links. The tide turns, their circumstances changed. And so we went back to this solution. What if we merged with them? And so we pitched that idea, and that worked. That was a yes. And so we had 5 managers, 5 people who'd been running together in their own ways, merge into one company. And on paper, this was absolutely brilliant, and this was going to work. And I can remember us when we announced it to the world, and then it happened. It was a big shakeup in the industry or in our local region, and we were all sitting in an office in the new building. It was day 2 or something like that. And one of the sales guys that had been selling us for years shows up and now sees us all together. He's getting the news, and I can remember him going, "Wow, bold, smart, like this is cool." Like, and you just felt so confident. And so we started doing the thing. What happened was we did not understand culture, how important culture is. And we did not understand how to merge teams together. And we brought people with us from these different companies, and then we all shoved them into one pre-existing system, not realizing that we had made a terrible mistake.
So real quick, just some clarification. You were an owning...
No.
Like how do you facilitate as a leader the merging of three companies?
Yeah.
Is there bigger powers at work in that?
Yeah. So one of these three was an independent small business. They had one location. The other two were part of a bigger owned by another company. They had 75 or 80 locations. And what happened was the owners of the bigger business had retired and they were selling off all the assets. And so this big disruption happened. And there was three of us, two general managers. I was an assistant manager at one of them. And there were three of us who suddenly found ourselves in a position where our company changed like we didn't know what the future looked like. And we recognized that we could take ourselves and a couple of our key people, bring them into this one independent business and bring all of our customers, all of our firepower, all of our influence, and just flood this one small company with just this really hotshot team.
Yeah.
We were bringing a ton of revenue. And the revenue was going to follow us. And so we spent about a month setting all this up. And we went out and we talked to people. We told them what was going on. Some of them would, most of them would say, yeah, I want you as my guy, so I'll go with you. I don't care what sign it says on the side of the truck, so to speak. So to a large degree, the big picture did work. We did end up getting this smaller company actually grew. They're still there. They're thriving now. And they are, I don't know what kind of revenue they're doing today, but I would say they arguably are one of the big gorillas now in the market. So on the larger sense of this thing, it was a good plan. It did work. But the road getting there had a bunch of casualties in it. So we had multiple leadership styles that we didn't know how to merge. We had multiple cultures that we didn't know how to merge. We had more entrepreneurial, sort of innovative culture coming in and trying to nest inside of a very much a stabilizing culture. We had people. I would take risks and have big ideas. And one of the other major power players in the equation did not like big ideas, and he didn't like change. He wanted stability. We had different pathways of making decisions, how we made decisions. And it was a mess, a big, huge mess.
Yeah. So how old were you back then, or how many years ago would that be back in your leadership?
I was about 29
okay.
when that happened.
So this would be like you're emerging. You've definitely got some years under your belt, but still a lot.
Yeah, my arrogance hadn't been tempered yet, but my competency was improving.
There you go.
So I was becoming better qualified at being an ass.
Yeah, that's right.
That was my side of the equation.
What were some of the assumptions that 29-year-old was making, looking into this dream? It's kind of rose-colored. It's got all this optimism and romance flowing, but clearly there's some assumptions being made because it didn't turn out fully.
So there's a few stories that kind of capture how I experienced this. One of them is, I was a change agent. This is the big learning. It took me years to figure this out, but I like to make change. Had studied change in school, in business school. Like I like to innovate and create and push out and push boundaries. The guy with the most power in this equation, I don't actually know what he would say he's like, but I experience him as being very change resistant, as someone who likes to maintain the status quo. And he didn't make decisions fast, and sometimes he just wouldn't make decisions. And so I need to move. I need decisions made. And so I was playing the forgiveness rather than permission game after a while. And I did that so many times, I just became a threat. What was interesting about it is I was doing things that were right. Like what I was doing actually had positive impact. I was cleaning things up and organizing things and consolidating and changing. We had one example is we had this whole warehouse. We had all kinds of property. It was at an old mill. That's where we were, and we had all kinds of warehouses. And one of them was just full of junk. It was just stuff collected over time.
Sure.
And then we had a certain amount of products we actually needed over there, and it was a long way away, and it was a big inefficiency. And so I figured out how to get those products, which probably took up 10% of that warehouse, into our main warehouse. I made room for them, got things reorganized, which made the selling of them way more efficient. And then I looked at everything else in this warehouse, and I just told the guys to back up the dumpsters, and I just threw it all away. Well, what it was a bunch of unmade decisions, and I unilaterally made it all. And he was so hot at me. He wouldn't even talk to me for a couple of days. So mad. And I just waited it out. And I don't know how long it took, maybe a month later, he was leasing that space out to another company and making money on it because it was a waste of, it wasn't being used effectively. Mm-hmm. And so there's a very real way you can say I was right. But in doing that the way I did it, I was completely wrong.
Sure.
And what I did was break trust. And that's wronger than creating an asset that we can actually rent again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way you lead is just as important or more than the results you achieve in your leadership. So I'm hearing you talk about, I heard you say there are 3 leaders in this equation.
Well, there's really 5, total of 5. And we created a couple factions, 6.
That come into this merge that are all equal status leaders?
Okay, so that's another huge immature mistake we made.
Got it.
We thought we could all come in as equal status. You can't have 6 people. That's not a thing.
Too many chiefs.
Too many chiefs. And in fact, there was that was said up front that certain. I mean, I didn't think I was equal. I came in in a junior role, but I intended to have as much influence as I'd had previously. Instead of being one of 2, I was now one of 6. Mm-hmm. And that dilutes you, that diffuses you. So then you have to grasp or grab for your power again. Where are you going to get it?
Well, you're going to prove it by clearing out a warehouse and making a decision.
Yeah. And so in this ecosystem, you also had to understand, well, culture is about telling a story. What story are we telling? And we're all kind of telling a little bit different stories. The story was we sell a certain kind of product to a certain kind of customer, but we'd always done that. But how do we get that done? And what are the values that matter? And so mine, for instance, I really, really valued protecting margin. I wanted to sell products at margin. I did not believe in discounting, and I ran kind of the retail side of it. Well, one of our other guys that had come in, he had been a manager of his own store, and he got to sell however he wanted, and his deal was make as many friends as you can, and if you got to cut margin, that's fine. It'll pay off in the end. And I'm like, that's just lazy selling. You can lower the price and make friends all day long. And in our culture, the guy that I came up with, we actually had this whole line where if you sold something, you sell a big job, but the margin wasn't there, and he'd see it, he'd literally say to you sometimes, so are you running for mayor? And the first time you hear it, you have no idea what, like, no, why? And he said, because you're better at making friends than you're at making money.
There you go.
Right? So there was this protect margin, and then we had this other culture of, no, give up margin for the long game, and it's just 2 different stories.
It is. It's like it's like marriage.
Right.
And you're not recognizing that you are bringing 2 worlds into one. And I mean, there's a lot that goes on to a marriage.
Trying to figure that out.
You got 6 people showing up. Naive.
That was that's at least how I would say I was behaving.
Sure.
But then there was another feature to it. Not only did we do a terrible job of negotiating how power was going to be shared, about roles, who was going to do what the actual vision was, we knew the metrics of success were going to be in our sales, but how does this all work? We had no idea. We were just going to do good, right? And so these power struggles start to emerge. And I would say the guy who was the most powerful positionally actually didn't know how to wield his power well yet. He probably figured it out over time. But he recruited a bunch of driven, powerful people.
Sure.
And then we kind of ate that system a lot. So there's a power vacuum. No problem. I'll fill it. Let me start, I'll go throw 80 yards of junk away.
What is the classic leader like that? It's lead or be led.
Correct.
That's the motto.
We chose, there was another moment where in the middle of all this, Maria, my wife, was pregnant with our first son. And there was a moment where this guy was so upset at me. We're 7 months pregnant, and he's on his way to fire me. My buddy shows up in the middle of that and intercepts and gets himself fired instead. So now he's gone. Then I find out what happened, and I'm now sitting here trying to figure out what to do. And at the time we actually called in our first executive coach. My first coaching experience was in the middle of this situation. A guy named Rick Corbin shows up. He's still operating down in Boca Raton, Florida. And he starts working with us. And he's just gently, patiently walking us through this mess. So this whole firing situation emerges. And now I'm on the phone with my boss, the guy that did the firing, his partner, me, the coach, and the guy that got fired, because we're trying to figure out what to do.
Wow.
Because the guy that got fired represented millions of dollars of revenue, and it was a bit of a sudden move, and it was a mistake on everybody's part. And so I'm now trying to get this guy his job back, which I accomplished. We actually got him back to work, and we got everybody settled down. But it was just this massive breakdown in trust. Like, yes, we're all going to come back and keep selling,
Right.
but I don't trust you.
Exactly.
And you can't do that.
No, not in the short term.
But here's what happened. And this is a whole nother hard but worth it story, which we'll tell maybe another time. But within a month later, our first son is born, and he's born with a terrible medical condition. He has open heart surgery at 3 days old, and then at 6 months old, we find out that there's another thing, and it's worse. And suddenly, I'm in a position fighting for survival. If I don't have medical insurance, we go bankrupt. If I don't have a job, we're screwed. Like, it became about this tension between this job that I'm not enjoying at all, but have to have.
Sure.
A situation at home that everybody's stressed and going through a traumatic experience. And as a result of that, my anxiety level goes through the roof, and it ramped me at work. So now I'm swimming in anxiety. I'm already swimming in a difficult situation, not showing up well. But suddenly, I have to keep this job. And it was just like the worst version of me. And so that plays out for a couple years, something like that.
So I'm curious there. That's interesting, because I think any leader who has gone through some hard in their life faces some of those moments where there's anxiety, stress to a point, but you're kind of in that place where you're saying you were not in your best form.
Not at all.
So what does that look like to you? And what have you learned from that? Because I think there's something even just in that, just to pull from, but like, you're not in your best form, you're operating from a place of anxiety. What does that look like?
I started to defend and protect, and the way I defend and protect is I attack. And so at that point, I was not precisely, but in my heart had squared off against this guy. You're the problem. If you would listen to me, if you would value me, if you wouldn't be so scared of me, if I wasn't such a threat to you, and my being a threat to you is a sign of your weakness, not mine, it's yours. If you weren't in my way, I could make this work. And now I have to figure out how to make this work, and I got to work around the guy who I need on my team. Like, we're supposed to be on the same team. And I've turned one of my teammates into the enemy. And it's not bad to have an enemy. That's fine. But they probably shouldn't be on your team.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And as a result of that, I'm unable to see him as he is. I'm unable to have compassion and empathy for who he is, for the value he brings. And then that just spills out into all these other kind of situations. But my attitude, my position of my heart, the mode I was showing up every day was I had I saw him as the problem, and I saw the circumstance as a place I was trapped and stuck, and I was fighting for survival. So that makes you righteous, right? I'm doing this for my family. Sure. No, nothing righteous about it.
So what did you do to snap out of that? Like, I mean, there's, you're a coach.
Yeah.
You've been doing it for a lot of years. So we would say, hey, what's the story?
Yeah.
Because there's this event happening, and then it's converting to emotions that are resulting, obviously, in behaviors that aren't helpful. You would agree those aren't helpful.
Right.
So then how do you get down to the story to go, what version of the story is Kirk telling himself, and how does he find a better version? Like, what are you doing to get out of that spot?
So I didn't do anything right to get out of the spot in the moment. Well, one thing I did is I made sure I sold stuff, right? Sell. In fact, in part of this journey, and this still makes no sense to me. As part of this journey, there was a moment where I was leading a team, and I'd been asked by the leadership team to go. We recognized a problem in one of our teams. I had the experience, and I was asked to go solve the problem. And so I moved in, took over that team, and I started solving the problem. In the process, though, this team, again, didn't like the way I was solving the problem. And I was right, but the way I was doing it was all wrong. And so they mutinied on me. They went around my back. They went and had a meeting with this more powerful person who then called me into his office and said, basically, he didn't say basically, he said, you have failed. They all hate you. You have to go apologize to all of them one at a time. And then we're going to put you over in this office because they don't know what to do with me now. We're going to put you in this office, and we've always wanted to start this other business. We have the room, we have the space. It's always been this good idea. You have 30 days to figure out if we should start that business or you're fired.
Wow.
And I was like, huh. Okay, so I get to go apologize to everybody and then go sit in an office by myself and build a business plan, or I'm fired? Like, the most obvious thing to do is say, yeah, this totally works. We should invest a lot of money in this right now. It's either a really, really dumb idea on his part, or I misunderstood his trust in me. Like, he wasn't saying you're fired. That's how I heard. He's like, or we don't know what to, there's no room for you here, but here's an opportunity. See if you can make this work.
That's interesting.
It's a completely different way to tell that story.
It is.
And it makes more sense, because why would you set somebody up the way I described it? It doesn't. Well, what happened was 2 weeks into that 30 days, I figured out the business wasn't actually viable. It was a break-even business at best. And so I never said that. I just went back down on the sales floor and I just started selling. And 30 days came and went.
So they gave you a little breather time, but then they just ignored the whole.
They ignored that whole. I must have said at some point, here's the model. It breaks even. But I had a book of business.
Yeah.
And so they're like, well, so it just kind of went away.
Yeah.
Because we avoid things like that, right? Interestingly, that guy then went and took over the team that I'd been leading, and 7 or 9 months later, fired everybody on that team but one person. So I was right. The team needed to be shooken up. And when I did it, they mutinied, but they couldn't mutiny against him.
Yeah.
Right. So all that's going on in that context. And I just sort of hunkered down and survived. And then about a year and a half later, I got a job offer. And so to solve all of this, it didn't even solve it. It just resolved it. I just left. I just quit. And even in the way I quit, there's an indicator that I was misreading the story. Because in my mind, I had just barely been hanging on. They didn't know what to do with me. I was this threat. And I thought they wanted me to go as fast as I could. And so I went and gave notice. I didn't even give a full 2 weeks. And they were hurt by that. They're like, after all we've done for you? I mean, you don't even have the respect. And I literally thought I was doing them a favor. Like, can we just be done, right? And again, I misread it. I was telling the wrong story.
Sure.
But in the end, I didn't do anything right, except I finally just left.
Yeah. So it sounds like you made a mess of things.
I certainly contributed substantially to a pretty messy situation.
And I can vouch for moments in my life where I was the mess maker as well, and then learning from it. But what was it in that made it, the biggest, mistake in your leadership? Like, help us find now, looking back, you probably have some really good insight as to why you would classify this as the biggest mistake.
We came into it with so much optimism and hope. And then to have it fall apart so fast and so profoundly to where 2 of us just had to leave. We just had to go. There was a sense of failure, like we didn't capitalize on it. We didn't get it done.
Sure.
And I saw myself as someone that could get things like this done. This is what I love to do. I recognized that I'd made the mess, but I didn't know how I made it. At that point when I left, I just left with my tail between my legs. I didn't know yet. I knew it was a mess, but I didn't know why. And it just felt low. It was a very, very low point in my attempt to become a leader. In the things that I'd done that led up to that, I'd been rough around the edges. I was young and ambitious and immature and all that kind of stuff, but I always had been able to create value. I always knew that the sum total, the net, was good.
Sure.
And in this case, it was obvious the net was bad, and I left having failed. As I said earlier, the business didn't fail. The business struggled during that. That's not even true. We were going gangbusters. So the idea itself was fine, And it comes back to that same idea throughout all these threads is the idea was good. The way I did it
Yeah.
is where the failure was.
So would you say kind of it's more of a personal failure?
Totally.
Yeah.
And a failure of my leadership. And I ran into my shadow. I ran into my dark side. I ran into how I can behave when pressed and threatened. And we had the whole thing going on in our family that amplified all that. And I wouldn't have said I was capable of being that unhelpful.
Yeah.
And I am.
Yeah.
Very much so.
And so today, you look at this and you go, okay, this was one of my biggest failures, big mistake, personal leadership failure in your life. What is Kirk today looking back? You can't go back and relive that moment, but what have you learned so that you don't repeat that? It's hard but worth it. So how do we make the worth? How do we get the worth it out of this story?
Yeah. So a lot of, for me, there's like 3 different major learning outcomes. They took years for me to understand. I had to actually go through, it was probably 5 more years of journey of experiencing myself and watching myself do different kinds of things to understand this. And I finally came to a place where I was able to make meaning out of that experience. Leaving with your tail between your legs is the hard part. If I hadn't understood it and been able to attach meaning to that story, if the story had remained, you just suck, you're too much, you can't handle these kinds of circumstances, it would have just been hard. There would have been no worth it.
Sure.
And the meaning I was able to come to understand, first of all, there was multiple circumstances, many, many circumstances where I can point to the outcomes and say, I was right. I was absolutely right in my perspective and completely wrong in how I approached it. And I like to be right. And at this point in my journey, I was pretty dedicated to being right. And I learned that you can be right and still be wrong, and that is wrong.
Right. I think Brene Brown says, rather than being right, it's more important to get it right.
Well said. I haven't heard that one from her before.
Yeah.
I had a friend who said, the way he would say it is, you get to choose sometimes between being right or being happy. And at that point in my journey, I was still very committed to being right, but I didn't know how to get it right. I really liked that. So I learned that in one event. It all came clear. And as I look back on it, I'm like, okay, I got that one. And to that point, I was just needed to be right all the time. Another one was, I am a fantastic value creation device. Me as a tool. Like I am really, really, really good in some circumstances and awful in others. And in this situation, inside of the previous culture, working with the other guy and the other company, everything I was doing seemed to be welcomed. It seemed to be good. It was encouraged. It was praised. And we were selling the exact same product in the exact same community to the exact same people, but in a different culture. And in that culture, everything I was doing was a threat. And I realized that the way I was showing up, I was trying to show up exactly the same. This is what I do. But I couldn't recognize that it wasn't welcome. Mm-hmm. And that idea helped me understand what my tool is. That I create motion and change. And if you put me in an environment that is trying to create stability and trying to minimize change, then I'm of no value. And I didn't understand that. I didn't even know what my value creation mechanism was at the time. And in retrospect, I was able to look back to that failure and see, I am extraordinarily valuable. The use of me is sometimes valuable. And in that situation, the use of me was not valuable. I actually needed to go and get out of their way. The third one is this. When I'm coaching people, this comes up. I don't tell this story, but this principle is something we use a lot. When you're working with somebody, or in this case for me, there's a point at which you come to the understanding that it's time to go. I'm in the wrong spot. This is not a good fit. I'm very good at what I do. I have customers, I'm selling. All that was fine, but it's just the wrong fit. And there's a point at which you come to that knowledge, and that starts a clock ticking. You don't have to leave right then, but you need to know it's time to go. and you got to start working towards that, because it's almost like there's an expiration date on you at that point.
That's right.
And if you stay too long, you will stink. And I stayed way too long, and I rotted. And when I'm working with people, you'll be talking through something, and I'll work a set of questions, and maybe over a month or so, we'll come to this place where they agree. It's not my decision, but they're like, yeah, I don't fit here anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, clock's ticking, and it's up to you to go. But I stayed way too long because I felt like if I left, I lost benefits, I lost money, I had nowhere to go. I trapped myself. And it's not worth it.
Well, you didn't play by the rules.
No.
Right? You didn't know what the rules were, but you were certainly playing by your own rules. You know, we had this experience when I was camp directing for 10 years. And we would run these youth camps week after week. And one of the ways that we would train our counselors who were over cabin groups of kids. So one counselor might have 7 or 8 junior high boys that week, and that's their cabin group, and they're like a family all camp week long. And certainly during junior high camp, especially, you have these unruly kids. They're testing the boundaries. Some are already through puberty and shaving already, and others aren't. So you have this huge dynamic in that camp. But you'd have these kids who show up, and usually the first counselor meeting would have after the first camp night. We debrief with the counselors, and we get this, man, my cabin group's, really tough. I've got this one kid, he just won't follow the rules. He just won't show up, complaining about everything, and it's like this battle is beginning, and we can see it. So we would always train that counselor. We'd say, hey, listen, that is just a sign of a leader. Who is looking for his own validation. So why not come to him in a special meeting, pull him aside from the rest of the kids and say, hey, I see leadership on your life, and how can we work together? Can I pull you in as a junior leader for the rest of the week and help me by being on time to every meal, and if it's something you don't like to eat, if you could just get excited about it because everyone's looking to you, they're following, and all of a sudden, that little breakout conversation turned a potential rebel into a leader, and now they're working for you instead of against you. So back to that moment, similar story, but if the key guy
you just
that you
called me a junior hire, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Which
you
is
did kind
true.
of make a mess of things. well, you did make a mess of things, and you were acting maybe like a junior hire.
I think it's a proper analogy.
But back in that moment, let's say if that leader were to come to you in a different way and maybe pull you in and acknowledge, would there have been a potential where you would have aligned had he made space for you? And if so, what would that have looked like? Like, could he have aligned you into running in that direction? Yes, you're a change guy. I get that. You may bring change into the mix, and that's your superpower, and that's what you're amazing at. But you can still work change into an environment where there needs to be stability. It's not like that has to leave. They can coexist. What would that have looked like?
I would guess, looking back on it, that he probably made a number of attempts at that.
Interesting.
And in my assessment, neither of us were capable at that point of getting that done. We were both too immature. But I think he was trying. We had a coach in the midst of this.
Yeah.
And at one point, it's interesting you say it this way because I don't know this to be the case. But at one point, that coach had he had a bunch of clients in the city, and he would bring them together for breakfast every morning. And he, for some reason that just shocked me, he started bringing me with him to those meetings, and we started doing this work together. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if that coach initiated that for this very reason. Like, you need to get this guy in and closer and work with him. And for a moment, we kind of calmed down, but we couldn't sustain it.
Yeah.
That's why I'm saying me leaving was part of the solution. Is
Right.
We had locked horns in a way that we just needed to get away from each other, or I needed to get out of the situation. But yeah, that's exactly who I was. I was that kid. And another variable in this was my loyalties stayed attached to the leader I came with. And when all the mess started to get created, he and I, in my estimation, became pigeonholed or pushed into this threatening position. And so my loyalty never attached to this new environment or this new leader. We stayed a fractious sort of tribal thing.
So worth it? Why?
It was worth it because in the process of becoming how we go through this life and in the leadership journey, I think everybody has some story like that. It's their version of that. It's the suffering part. It's the hard, like it was really, really hard on my ego. It broke me in many ways. And we say about suffering, you say it either makes you or breaks you. And I like to modify that by going, it breaks you. That's not a question. The question is, what will it make of you? And it took time, but that event, those years I spent there, in many ways, they contributed to making me who I am today because I can reflect back on how bad that was, how hard it was, and how much I contributed to that hard. But it gives me a mirror to look into. It gives me an abyss to look into and see the dark spots of me. But in doing that, I can also see that I was trying so hard to accomplish this thing, and that they were good. I just didn't do it right. Mm-hmm. But that's a reflection that you can go, oh, well, A, don't do that again, and B, do it this other way. It begins to point to the right way to do things.
Good.
And I can still feel that impulse to take control and move too fast, and like that's still there. But I'm now familiar with what happens when I just unleash it in ways that are unhelpful.
Right.
They say that you don't have to wish suffering on your enemy. It will come. And this is one of those things I would never wish that on somebody. I would never set somebody up for this kind of situation. But what I know is we set ourselves up for it. The only question is, can you look at it? I would say it was bad, right? But it was the kind of bad that I can now say was good and necessary. And I would say, looking back, I learned more in the reflection, in the post-analysis of it, I learned more reflecting back on that about who I am and my leadership style than from almost any other event in my life. And so it's very clear to me that I wouldn't be who I am today without that event. It's also clear to me that at some point I was going to have that event.
Yeah. It's interesting too to think like I've seen this happen in relationships in my life where people who I was not really attracted to for chemistry reasons of personality or styles, where there was a real friction or a tension, reacquainting with them 10 or 15 years later, we've actually become really good friends, almost best friends, to go, what changed in me and what changed in that person along those 15 years that now somehow we couldn't stand to be around each other, or at least we wouldn't prefer to be around each other. And now, I mean, we're texting really close in each other's lives, our families' lives. You go, what happened there? It's probably some of our own individual suffering and learning and tempering that now what we were as much the problem as they were.
Right.
And I think if we even look at that to some of the leaders, like I'm thinking of a leader in my life, I can go back 20 years where I wonder now if me being the person I am today and him having grown these same years, if we'd even have the same issues. Right. If we were put in the same exact scenario, or if those would just all be erased because I've grown and tempered myself and seen, I'm more empathetic, I'm more self-aware, I'm more aware of others and have grace and tolerance. But chances are that person has done some of that growing too.
This is an interesting question. I don't have an experience. Those relationships, I don't have access to them anymore, so I don't know what's happened since. When I think about who I am today and who they were then, I think I do that math. I'm like, I could actually show it pretty well. But what you're pointing out is they're not that anymore. And what's interesting is of that group, two of them are now, one of them is now running that company. It's big, it's doing great. One of the other guys is now actually running the big gorilla in that city.
Interesting.
So out of this group was all of this capacity. The talent was real. One of us went on and is working in the same industry for one of the biggest privately held versions of this in the country, and he's done really well. I'm now doing this. We have all succeeded. At the time, though, we couldn't do it together. So the question, could we put that team back together, and could we do amazing things? Probably, because everybody's gone on in life to figure it out and to find places of great value creation.
Yeah, and have you ever thought, not that you would go back to do the same thing again, but have you ever thought of going back and just shaking a hand and saying, hey, let's grab a cup of coffee and talk it out?
I haven't actually thought of doing that. I did actually communicate with them a number of years later. So when I started to put this together and figure out, really see myself and what I'd contributed. Because in the beginning, you're just like, that guy was an idiot and he didn't appreciate me. And so, that's not true. So I actually wrote him a letter at one point and I'm like, hey, dude, I'm sorry. And I was an ass. Yeah. And then later on, there was actually talk of me actually going back to work for him at one point. His business partner got a hold of me and was like, hey, would you ever come back? We could really use you right now. And I was like, yeah. I mean, I gave it some real thought. But I didn't want to move back to town. But yeah, someday it would be nice to actually find out what their version of that story was. Cause I don't know. And I do know I got the story wrong. I don't think I truly understood what was going on. And there's places I probably have it pretty right. Hey, if you enjoyed that and have your own journey of a leadership failure like that, we'd love to hear about it in the comments, or you can shoot us an email. You can get a hold of me at kirk@iconcoaching.com, or you can get a hold of Mitch at mitch@iconcoaching.com. We'd love to engage you and hear your stories about that. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like, but most importantly, share this thing. That is one of the best ways that you can help us get this message out and so more people can find us.